Hello, I'm Shelley Klein, historian and director of education at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. Thank you for joining us today to watch The Art of the Possible: Christian Resistance in Nazi Germany, presented by Dr. Beth Griech-Polelle, the Kurt Mayer Chair of Holocaust Studies at Pacific Lutheran University. This program was originally presented on August 24th, 2025. Dr. Polelle, the floor is yours.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Shelley Klein and to all of her fantastic staff at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to the audience in August, and I am doubly appreciative that I'm able to now join you through this recording today. So the topic that we have at hand to tackle is what I'm calling the art of the possible: Christian resistance to the Nazi regime. And I'm going to have to provide us with a little bit of background information before we can actually leap into what are some examples of types of Christian resistance. So I'd ask you to just kind of follow along, and let's kind of get right into the definitions of resistance. And of course, as historians, when we look at resistance and the issue of resistance in the Nazi regime, a near totalitarian dictatorship, we recognize that there are all types of limits placed upon people to engage in acts of resistance. For many scholars, there's a real debate about what counts as resistance. And for most people, the idea is resistance must mean armed uprising, armed rebellion, getting a gun and trying to assassinate Hitler or overthrow his regime. The people that would have had access to weaponry in Nazi Germany would be primarily people in the military and police forces. And so when we talk about Christian resistance, we have to do it with the recognition that most people are not going to have access to weaponry. They're not going to have a skill set that would make it possible for them to engage in kind of armed uprising and rebellion. And on the screen, you can see on the slide that I've added in other words that scholars have used to try to help us wrestle with this concept of what really counts as resistance. So you'll see words like opposition, nonconformity, selective opposition, and so on. And so I thought it might be helpful for us when we are thinking about this topic to consider, again, what's called the art of the possible. And that allows us to expand the definition. What kind of tools did people have in their toolkit? And I'm going to keep using that toolkit metaphor throughout the lecture. What skills did they bring to this idea of I will not comply with what the Nazi regime is asking me to do? Okay, so a little bit of background context for you to kind of place this in a much broader frame. Hitler was appointed the Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January, 1933. And you can see from the slide, when we look at the overall population, Germany is, by and large, a Christian nation. 66 million people are living in Germany. Approximately 41 million identify as Protestant, 21 million identify as Roman Catholic. You can also see from the slide that the Jewish population is infinitesimally small percentage-wise. Out of 66 million German people, there's about 525,000 people who self-identify as being Jewish. And then, of course, then we have a whole kind of category of others, people who are unaffiliated with any religious institution, or those who belong to much smaller denominations. How do I know those kinds of statistics? How do I know how people self-identify? It has to do with the system in Germany whereby when parents have a newborn baby, when you fill out the information that goes on a birth certificate, not only do you put the child's statistics, right, their weight, their height, and so on, but you are also supposed to put a religious denomination or affiliation. And that is because in Germany, the system worked in such a way that when that baby grew to adulthood and got employed, some of their tax money was then directed towards whichever church they were affiliated with to support the church. And so for historians, this gives us at least a good grasp on how did people self-identify. Now, I'll put in kind of the little caveat there that that also means that there are plenty of people who their names still appeared, their tax money still went to whatever particular church they went to. However, for some of them, they might never have really gone to church, right? And so we can't tell that, yes, all of these people went to church and religious services on Saturday or Sunday, but we at least know that this was in existence, and it gives us at least some insight into the numbers involved. And this leads me to thinking about what another very well-known scholar named Henry James Cargis once wrote. He said he was in the midst of studying about the Holocaust, and all of a sudden it hit him that who are the killers? Who are the perpetrators? And I put a quote up on the slide. He says, "One day it occurred to me that every killer of Jews, of gypsies, of Jehovah's Witnesses, of homosexuals was a baptized Christian. It takes a lot of people to kill a lot of people. And the murderers, the traitors, the profiteers, the onlookers all had Christian backgrounds." And I think that's worth really ruminating on, thinking about, right? That here are people who at least nominally identify as being Christian. And so when we talk about Christians and resistance, what I'm going to be trying to show to you is that it is going to really take an extraordinary person to rise above all of the social constraints, all of the political constraints, to kind of rise to this occasion and say, I simply cannot live with my conscience if I do not rebel. That if I force myself to conform and comply with Nazi regulations and Nazi demands, my conscience will be so troubled, and therefore I have to do something. And so we're going to kind of explore more about this. Again, as a little bit more background, so bear with me here. For our purposes, I think it is useful for us to also stop and think about what was Hitler and the official kind of Nazi party attitude. What were their views on Christianity? And here we can go all the way back to 1920, when Hitler really took over a pre-existing political party and renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or what we normally just call the Nazi Party. And when he did that in 1920, they made a 25-point program, right? This is what the Nazi Party stands for. This is what we're going to campaign on. This is what we believe. And point 24 out of 25 points makes reference to supporting what the Nazis call, in quotes, positive Christianity. And I put on the slide that I cannot really even explain that to you. Hitler never explained it. Neither did other Nazi leadership. But what was clear in that statement about what we support positive Christianity was that they were very adamant that if a person was Jewish, and in the early days in the 1920s and early 30s, if you were an atheist, then you were not to be included in the Nazi, what's called the Volksgemeinschaft, which just means the people's community, that you were to be excluded. It's also, I think, to undergird that point, if we go back to point 24, in that particular point, it states that who can be a citizen of Germany? Well, only a person of what they call German blood. And of course, if you know a lot about Nazi racial beliefs, they believe that Jews have different blood that gives them their so-called Jewish qualities and characteristics. And therefore, Jews are not entitled in a world ruled by the Nazis to be citizens of Germany. They're labeled as foreigners, as aliens. And so again, pushing them to the out of the people's community, to the absolute margins of society. Now, why, when Hitler himself was raised as a Catholic in Catholic Austria as a young person, he, of course, moved away from really practicing Catholicism, but he always maintained in the Nazi Party membership handbook, he always kept after his name the designation that he was Roman Catholic. And we don't, I'm Catholic, we don't want him, right? So I would argue that he wasn't really a practicing Catholic. But if you think about why is Hitler reaching towards this concept, this nebulous phrase of positive Christianity, it's because he recognizes that if he's going to lead a mass movement, Catholics only represent 21 million, but Protestants represent 41 million. And so he constantly makes reference to kind of his dream would be a political party where a Protestant man and a Catholic man can sit shoulder to shoulder and that they're united by the common Christianity and by their ethnicity, by being Germanic. And he would constantly also argue that when Catholics and Protestants don't work together, in his mind, it's because Jews are encouraging this division so that there isn't this kind of unified people's community. Um, for Hitler, on a personal level, whenever he's asked a question about Catholics versus Protestants, he always takes a position of neutrality, right? So he will not weigh in on Catholicism and Protestantism because he doesn't want to alienate that larger segment of the Protestant population, nor does he want to lose Catholic support as well. So I think those are kind of important for us to at least think about and be aware of. And here we can see a slide of Hitler with just tons of people that have turned out. And this is in the early years, right? That here are people that are saying, I might be Catholic, I might be Protestant, but what really unifies all of us is our Germanity, that we've got that precious Aryan blood. Even within Christianity, we're going to find that there are different, again, related to this idea of factions. For Roman Catholics, they have, in a way, a tighter system, right? That we have a hierarchical institution. You go from the Pope as the leader of the church to the cardinals, and then it goes down to archbishops and bishops and monsignors and parish priests. And so you have this kind of unified structure. Now, in many respects, that is wonderful for keeping cohesion, but at the same time, it can be limiting because if the Pope doesn't make a statement that's definitive about what Catholics should be doing with regard to Nazi ideology, then all of the further chain of command might remain silent as well. So in some ways, that hierarchical institution can limit what type of resistance people can contemplate. For Lutherans in particular, the situation is even more factionalized, if that's really a word. The evangelical Lutheran community really is split into, in many cases, actually three different kind of components. We have what's called the Deutsche Christen, the German Christians. And here I'd ask you to really think about the choice of language here. When they say we are German Christians, what are they saying? They're not saying we're Christians who happen to live in Germany, who happen to be German. We are saying we are Germans who happen to be Christian. And for that particular segment of the population that become German Christians, they want to bring Christian teachings into alignment with National Socialist ideology. And that means that they're going to believe in the concepts that the Nazis put forward about racial inequality, about Aryan superiority. Of course, they're going to stress to their followers that they must be obedient to state authority and work with Hitler and the Nazi regime. And they try to persuade any German Christians to not consider marrying with Catholics, with people who are not in the German Christian movement, and especially no intermarriage with Jews. So that's going to be one section of the population, and they're going to incorporate Nazi symbolism into their project. When the Deutsche Christen begin to gather some steam in the 1930s and get more followers, they're trying to really kind of come close in a relationship with Hitler, right? Look, we support what you support. Don't you favor us, the German Christians, over all other groups? That sparks what's called the Pastors' Emergency League. And it's an emergency, right? These are the Lutheran ministers who gather together and they begin to say, we recognize that there's a threat from the Nazi regime towards Christianity, but we also recognize a threat within Lutheranism from this branch of German Christians. Now, ultimately, that Pastors' Emergency League really kind of morphs into a more less of an emergency league and into an actual group that is called the Confessing Church. Now, the Confessing Church is really, again, coming out of that emergency league. Most of the ministers that are leaders in the Confessing Church are not necessarily against every aspect of Nazism, but what they fear is that the Nazi regime is actually going to try to corrupt the churches from within, that they're going to allow the German Christian movement to change their worship services, to interfere in theological and dogmatic issues. And so they didn't, they were mostly focused on that. And then if you're looking at the slide, you can see that there's a whole nother group, which is by and large probably the largest part of the Lutheran population that scholars have just called the neutrals. And these would just be average people who really don't necessarily support the German Christian movement, nor do they really want to be part of the Confessing Church. And they're a little bit afraid that maybe they're in opposition to the government. And so you get this really factionalized, divided landscape. And of course, for Hitler, part of the way he operates is to divide and conquer. The more groups of people cannot come together and unify and share a common purpose, the weaker they become, the easier they are to control. And here I'll just bring up a slide that gives you an example of the German Christian movement and how they, again, sought to reconcile Lutheran teachings with Nazi ideology. And this was, again, they used the colors of the Nazi swastika flag. We've got a swastika, the crooked cross in the center of the cross. And then, of course, DC stands for German Christians. And you could go into some of these German Christian controlled Lutheran churches, and what would you find? You'd find these types of symbols. You would often find that the Deutsche Christian minister in charge of the church had rewritten hymns so that when people were in church services, they would be singing about how Hitler was the German Messiah come to save the German people. It truly is a very radical movement. Over the course of the 12 years of the Third Reich, the Deutsche Christian movement begins to splinter and almost kind of splinters itself into pretty insignificant groups. But in the early 30s, this was a very strong movement. And the fear, of course, for the Confessing Church was that the Deutsche Christians were going to take over all of the seminaries, all of the theological faculty positions at universities. And so this was quite a real serious threat to Lutheranism. All right, so one more kind of element to fold in here. For most of the both Catholic and Lutheran leadership, we would, I think most of us would like to just automatically believe that if you say Christian and you say National Socialist ideology, you would say, well, they can't go together, right? That they're just mutually incompatible. Nazism praises Aryan superiority and racial blood purity and hatred of so many groups of people beyond Jews and so forth. And Christianity is supposed to preach love and love of God, love of your neighbor. And unfortunately, for many Christian leaders, what we're going to find under the rise of the Nazis in Germany, many of them are going to believe that the Christian denominations are under such severe threat from Hitler and the Nazi regime that that is all they can focus on. That means that they have to narrow their vision and say, I can only worry about, if I'm a Catholic priest, I can only worry about other Catholics in Germany. How do I keep the church open? How do I keep the Catholic school systems going? And the same holds true for many Lutheran ministers as well. And what I'll be kind of trying to argue here is that what that does is kind of allows them to say, we are going to dig our heels in and we will offer opposition when it impacts our community, our group. And our group has been so narrowed that if you're Catholic, it's only fight for Catholics. If you're Lutheran, you're only going to fight for Lutherans. And so there's out of those major population groups, most people are not interested in extending the fear of maybe we should actually be defending Jews as well. And so this is really a handicap that's going to work in Hitler's favor because they're going, for most church leaders, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, they're going to basically say the Jews are on their own. And there's a real unwillingness on the part of many of these leaders to seriously contemplate that what is being carried out against Jewish people is much exponentially larger in degree and significance than to what attacks Christians are actually facing. And so that kind of leads me into talking to you a little bit about the persecutions and discriminations, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that church leaders, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, were imagining that they were being discriminated against or that their members were being persecuted, because in reality, there were discriminations, there were persecutions, there are going to be martyrs in both Catholic and Protestant circles because of the Nazi persecution. So I just put on the slide here. I again want you to understand that they're not imagining that they're being persecuted. There is a level of real persecution. However, they are unable to then also say, yes, we are our religious group is being discriminated against, but they're not trying to eradicate every single Catholic man, woman, and child. They're not trying to eradicate every single Protestant man, woman, and child, but they are doing that to Jews. And so here on the slide, I'll just touch on a few of these examples. And I really focused particularly for 1937, because 1937 is a big year for a lot of different attacks against both Catholics and Protestants. Really beginning back in 1935, Catholic priests and Catholic nuns were being arrested, and it would be front page in Nazi-controlled newspapers, really kind of pushing that Catholic priests and Catholic nuns were engaging in immoral behavior. And so you get these very salacious stories that accuse nuns that run educational facilities, that they're engaging in orgies with their students, right? You've got priests being arrested for all kinds of sexual accusations. And these, again, these are headline news because it's got sex, it's got scandal. And part of the high publicity is to try to encourage average lay people, average German Catholics that are not priests or nuns, to be suspicious of their spiritual advisors and their leaders, right? Maybe they are immoral. Maybe we should really keep an eye out on those priests and nuns. In addition to those trials of the morality trials, there's also what are called the currency trials. Nazi Germany had very strict regulations about taking currency out of the country and then coming from another country and bringing foreign currency in. And in particular, nuns were frequently targeted for traveling outside of Germany. Many nuns had what were called mother houses for their particular order, and they were in another country. And so they might go to France, they might go to Belgium, they might go to Holland. And of course, this is in the days long before there was a common European currency like the euro. And so every country that you go to, you are exchanging currency. And the imagery that the Nazis put out are nuns that are smuggling in foreign currency as part of a plot to really weaken the German Nazi economy. For evangelical church leaders, the Nazis go to the trouble of establishing an entirely separate court system. And on the slide, it's called Court for Legal Matters Affecting the Evangelical Church. It's established in 1937, but it has the ability to reach back into 1933 and bring forward cases that have been brought against Lutheran ministers. And again, this can result in them being sent to prisons or to concentration camps. So when we're talking about Christians feeling like they are being persecuted, just from these examples, you can see, yes, they are being persecuted. Things escalate with Catholics in 1937 because the Pope at the time issues what's called an encyclical, and it's mit brennender Sorge, which means with burning sorrow, and it condemns the racism of the Nazis. But the Pope was very cautious, and he does not say anti-Semitism. He just condemns this idea of holding up in adulation the concept of racial purity, racial superiority. And that encyclical was smuggled into Germany, and it was read out in every single Catholic church at every Mass on the same exact day in 1937. And so this kind of exploded for the nut. How did the church smuggle this in? How did they coordinate this effort to read this out in their churches? And Hitler was livid about this, right? And so he orders that now, anytime Catholics want to have a pilgrimage or a public procession, they have to go to, for anyone who wanted to have a public event, you'd have to go to the police in that community and get a permit. And Hitler says these permits are going to be rejected, right? We're not going to allow the pilgrimage, the processions to take place. In Nazi Germany, men who were of Aryan descent, so of non-Jewish descent, who were single and who had fathered no children, were required to pay what was called the bachelor tax. So the government was punishing men for not doing their duty and having more Aryan children. And so after this papal encyclical hits Germany, now Catholic priests are going to have to pay the bachelor tax, which is just kind of mind-boggling, right? But if you know anything about the Catholic Church, right, the priests take vows of celibacy. And so, no, they're not allowed to be fathering children. And really, Hitler has priests kind of coming and going. If they don't father children, they have to pay the bachelor tax. But if they did father a child, then they're going to be arrested for immoral behavior, and they'll be front page news in a morality trial. And so there are persecutions. Another from the Protestant side, and we'll speak about Pastor Martin Niemöller frequently for the rest of this presentation. But Niemöller finds himself arrested in the summer of 1937. And on the slide, I have a biblical quote that is really the real reason why he was arrested. In the summer of 1937, Niemöller gave a public sermon, and it was based on Bible reading. And he said, "Obey God rather than men." Now, that might sound not that hard for us, in modern day democratic society, but in Nazi Germany, where you have the cult of the Führer, right, and looking up to Hitler, and every organization is supposed to imitate the structure of the Nazi regime, called the Führerprinzip, the Führer principle, the leader principle, to then put forward this idea that you should obey God and your conscience rather than what men are ordering you to do. This is simply too much, and Niemöller will be arrested. Technically, if you really want to know the technical reason why Niemöller is arrested, is that prior to giving that sermon in 1937, when he was in a church service, he read out the names of former parishioners who had filled out paperwork saying that they were formally withdrawing from the Lutheran Church. And this was, again, a way of publicly shaming people, right, for abandoning their religious principles. And in the Nazi regime, it was illegal to read out these names in public because the Nazis are trying to encourage people, stop giving your tax money to these churches, stop listening to priests and to pastors, move away from them. And so that's the technical reason that gets Niemöller arrested. And I will talk more about him. So we'll pick up his thread in a minute. I think one of the really kind of alarm bells that should have alerted both Catholics and Protestants by 1939, the order has been given that in the future, whenever cities are being redesigned, when changes are being made or new cities are being built, there is no allotment for any new churches to be built. And if you are in the Protestant or Catholic Church leadership, that should really worry you, right? That what is this regime saying? That they don't value religion, and if there's a new community being formed, that you're not going to set aside any land for a new church, which would mean that people might have to travel great distances. So again, and here is just I took this excerpt from a Nazi newspaper. This is one of the images that would have been hitting the newspaper readers, and you can kind of make out that the front image is of a Catholic nun, and then behind her, kind of cut off, is a stereotypical image of a Jew with his kind of unhuman claw-like fingers. And he's holding a bag of currency, right? And so this is, again, that somehow Catholic nuns are in league with Jews and smuggling foreign currency to destroy the German economy. So these persecutions that Catholic and Protestant leaders are worried about are in fact happening. And in some respects, once Hitler invades Poland and Germany is at war, the persecutions continue. They do not go away. And so almost immediately, anyone who still had a confessional school open is pressured to shut it down. And the Nazis argue that Catholic and Protestant children, of course, should be in school together to learn how to be a unified Germanic people. And by 1939, Jewish children are forbidden to attend any public schools in Germany. And so that kind of will force them to find all Jewish educational self-financed systems. In addition to that, you're going to have new rules that now say that in those new public German schools, priests and ministers should not be the educators. They should, and particularly, they announced that they shouldn't be teaching the religion classes, which to me seems like, wow, that's their whole area of expertise, is to have them come and teach a religion class, but they're not supposed to be allowed to do this. For many ministers and priests, they begin to complain to the Nazi regime that they would like to be able to mail religious materials to soldiers on the front lines to give them, moral support. And that is illegal. They are not allowed to do this. We're going to find that with the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and the creation of SS units, they have no military chaplains assigned to them, so that you have no access as a believing Christian to have a church worship service. If you're Catholic, to go to a confession, you have no access to these military chaplains. Church properties will be confiscated over this point in time. The Nazi regime argues that because of wartime evacuations, more housing is needed, and therefore they're going to literally kick nuns out of their convents and put fleeing refugees inside of these buildings. Any youth organizations that were church affiliated are now banned. That means that for youth, it's either the Hitler Youth or the League of German Girls. And you can kind of see that this is going to lead to the unraveling of what, in many cases, had been fairly tight knit communities. And particularly as the war years go on, and as Germany is heavily bombarded by both the Royal Air Force and the US Air Force, people are running hither and yon, and that means that you have lost all of that kind of communal connection that you had. And so this, again, is working against what Hitler always said, oh, I'm creating the Volksgemeinschaft. But in reality, he is ripping these communities apart. And this, of course, gives him more power. So I hope that that kind of makes the case for you in your mind that there is, in fact, a level, a degree of persecution for Christians. But of course, if you know a great deal about the persecution of Jews by the Nazis, it is just a drop in the bucket what Christians are experiencing as compared to what Jews are experiencing. Nevertheless, despite all the bad stuff that I've been telling you, there are Christians who are not going to comply, right? They are not going to go along with the Nazis' encroachments into their religious lives, into their very own conscience. And then there are going to be an even smaller number of Christians who say, yes, I recognize that my faith is under attack, but I also understand that people who practice the Jewish faith are under an even more severe threat, and that I have to stand for them as well. And so I'm going to now give you some actual examples of Christians who at first are narrowly focused on, I need to protect Catholics, I need to protect Lutherans. And then I'm going to give you the final examples that are those rare, extraordinary people who say, I'm worried about Catholics, I'm worried about Protestants, but I'm also very worried about what is being done to Jewish people. Okay, so I promise you I talk about Niemöller, and if you're looking at the slide, you can see that he's there. But let me kind of tell you just a little bit about a Roman Catholic bishop who, right before he dies in 1946, was made a cardinal. This was a man that I did my dissertation research and became my first book. So I know a whole lot about him, but I'm just going to try to give you a little kind of thumbnail sketch. For this bishop at the time, Clemens August Graf von Galen, he has made up his mind that he is willing to become a martyr, but a martyr for Catholic issues. And so he is one of our examples of someone who is either unwilling or unable to kind of open up his field of vision to think about not only Catholic issues, but to think in a broader term. Now, as bishop, and I had told you at the beginning, I was going to use the metaphor of a toolkit, right? As a bishop, what's in his toolkit? What's the art of the possible for him? Well, the art of the possible is he can give public sermons, he can lead processionals, he can lead pilgrimages, he can write letters, he can speak with a kind of moral authority. And so in one particular area, he does that. And in 1941, in the summer, and this was really just a few months after the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazi regime, von Galen has been collecting evidence that since 1939, the Nazi regime has been killing first mentally and physically disabled children, and then they started in what they call an adult, and in quotes, euthanasia campaign. And of course, euthanasia is a misuse of the terminology. Every one of the adults who are murdered in the Nazi euthanasia campaign are outright murdered. They're not asking to be put out of misery. They're not asking for some type of assisted suicide. They are being outright murdered, and they're being murdered in gas chambers. Von Galen has gathered enough information that finally in August of 1941, he goes to the high noon mass and he wakes everybody up at church. He was not really known by his parishioners for being an outstanding, speaker that really riled them up. But on that August, hot, sticky summer day, he went into church and he was fired up. And what did he do? He gave them very specific examples. He says there's a 55-year-old farmer who has been murdered because he had mental health issues. And he's been murdered by our government in the name of our people, saying we're freeing up all these resources by killing off this man. And he says that man has a son, and his son is risking his life in the military in the Soviet Union. And if he survives fighting in the Soviet Union and he comes back to our territory, what are we going to tell him? His father was murdered while he was off fighting for his country. And von Galen then says to the parishioners, he says, you do not need a written commandment or a written law, thou shalt not kill. He says, you know that killing is wrong. It is written in the human heart. And von Galen takes this very brave, strong stance denouncing the Nazi euthanasia campaign. Once he's put this out there, that what was supposed to be a secret murder killing campaign of euthanasia now becomes kind of public knowledge. Copies of his sermon get typed and retyped by priests and nuns. They get smuggled all across Germany. And so here we have an example of someone who was brave, and he fully expected that once he gave that sermon, he would be denounced. The Gestapo, the secret police, would come to the bishop's palace and take him into custody. He'd be tortured, he'd be executed. And von Galen had made his peace with that because he said, there is no such thing as euthanasia in Catholic ideology. Right? Only God determines when you die and the manner in which you die. So this is against Catholic moral teaching. And he was willing to be a martyr for a Catholic cause. But he was not willing to then challenge all those parishioners and people that were there that summer August day. Some of them reportedly were crying, right? That here was this bishop really, giving it to them. And unfortunately, he doesn't really follow that up with challenging. He's never interrogated, he's never arrested. And so, again, with that toolkit at his disposal, he could have gone back in and said, okay, I successfully exposed this murderous campaign that the government was killing our own people. Maybe I could go further and challenge my parishioners to extend care to the Jewish community. But he is, again, either unwilling or unable to do that. For Pastor Martin Niemöller, he's in many respects very similar to von Galen. They were both extreme German nationalists, and they found that element of National Socialism very appealing. But Niemöller is one of the key players that is forming that Pastors Emergency League when the German Christian movement is taking on steam. He ultimately is the leader of the Confessing Church. And for Martin Niemöller in particular, he himself admits he will ultimately survive years of imprisonment and concentration camps. And at the end of all of that experience, he has to kind of admonish himself and say, I actually was anti-Semitic. And so I didn't really care to encourage my followers in the confessing church to reach into the Jewish community and look out for them. And so, again, much like von Galen, Niemöller is willing to become a martyr, but he's only willing to be a martyr on issues that affect the Lutheran churches and theology. What both of these men share is that they really are trying to force people in their congregations to think about the disparity between National Socialist ideology and Christian ideology. And they're at least raising for some people this moral question: can you be a good Nazi and be a good Christian simultaneously? And I would argue that, in fairness to both of these men, they would have said, no, you really can't. But they don't seem to want to use all of the tools that they have at their disposal, writing letters of protest, making those sermons, leading public events, leading processionals. They're just not willing to go further. And so, and these are just a picture. On the left side, you've got Martin Niemöller, and then you've got Bishop von Galen with the big crucifix around his neck, just so you can get an image of them. All right, now I want to give us, I think, probably what you really came for, right? Who are those people who resisted in a much broader way? And my first example is a Catholic Monsignor named Bernhard Lichtenberg. And Lichtenberg, by the time we're looking at him, he's in his mid 60s. He's a Monsignor at the cathedral in Berlin, so a very prominent, important place. And Lichtenberg has very early on been worried about that question. Can you be a good Catholic, in his case, and a good Nazi? And Lichtenberg, I think, has come to the conclusion that no, these ideologies are mutually incompatible. And so what are you going to do about it, right? And so Lichtenberg is one of the people who supports von Galen in denouncing the euthanasia program because it goes against Catholic teaching. During 1938, when the Nazis enact a massive pogrom, this just wave of destruction all across Germany that the Nazis called Kristallnacht, or what we call Night of Broken Glass, Lichtenberg was so offended by the burning of synagogues, the arrests, and the beatings of Jews publicly, that he actually put out a flyer that he distributed himself to the neighborhood in and around where he lived in Berlin, saying, synagogues are houses of God. What are people doing? So he's becoming more vocal in his opposition. So he's kind of already on the Nazi Gestapo radar for being kind of a troublemaker, right? And as things escalate against the Jewish population and as persecutions get more severe, Lichtenberg makes a decision. And this might disappoint you. I know when I teach, this kind of disappoints my students. They want something really dramatic. What does he do? He, every day when he's in the cathedral and says the noon mass, and again, people come on their lunch hour and attend a church service there. At a certain point in the mass, Catholics, we pray for the world, we pray for different issues and so forth. And Lichtenberg inserts into that moment, he asks anyone who happens to be present at church on that given day, he basically says, now we should pray for the fate of the Jews. Now, again, that always disappoints students, right? What? But we have to kind of place that in the context that he is living in Nazi Germany. You can be arrested for any number of minor infractions. And to actually raise the awareness for many of those people sitting in that church on any given noon mass, they might not know any Jewish people any longer, right? Because they've been segregated. Jews have been isolated from the so-called Aryan population. And Lichtenberg is forcing them to continue to think about Where are the Jews? What is happening to the Jews? And this is by now 1941 when Germany has begun deporting the German Jewish population to the East. And of course, in Nazi propaganda, what are people told? If anyone even bothers to think about, well, where are they taking the Jewish people to? The government response is typically Jews are internal enemies, and therefore we have to get them out of German society, off of German ground. We're sending them to the East where they will work in factories and they'll work on farms for the German war effort. Well, of course, many people in the back of their minds are saying, I don't believe you. And Lichtenberg is one of the people who's a skeptic. I do not believe you. As the story goes, Lichtenberg, in one of these noon masses, asks the parishioners to pray for the fate of the Jews as these deportations are ongoing. Two young ladies happen to be taking an architectural tour during the lunch hour of the cathedral. They're Protestant, not Catholic. They hear what he has said. One of the girls' father is an SS officer. At dinner that night, the girl tells her dad what she heard the Catholic priest say. And he says, oh, we're going to look into that. And Lichtenberg is arrested. And the charge against him is treason. It's now treason in Nazi Germany to pray for the fate of the Jews because it implies you're questioning what the Nazi regime is telling you is happening to the Jews. Okay, it's 1941. Lichtenberg is arrested for treason. He's put on trial. And at that point in 1941, many people are from the parish and from the larger community are watching the trial. What is happening to Father Lichtenberg at this trial? And so Lichtenberg uses that trial, again, he's already a public speaker as a priest, right? And he's at this trial and he challenges publicly the Nazi regime. He says, if nothing bad is really happening to the Jewish people when you're so-called evacuating them to the East, then put me on a train with them. I'll work in a factory. I'll work on the farm. If nothing bad is happening to Jews, then prove it and let me go with them. Of course, the Nazi regime cannot do this, right? If they put Lichtenberg on a train that's deporting Jewish people, there might be people who follow the train and they might discover that people are being deported to ghettos. They're being sent to execution, killing sites, and then, of course, later to concentration camps. And so instead, they sentenced Father Lichtenberg to 2 years of hard labor in a German prison. By 1943, Lichtenberg's health has really been destroyed because the prison warden is told that he should allow the other prisoners to be abusive to this now in his late 60s-year-old man, to abuse him and to make him perform hard labor. And in 1943, when Lichtenberg is finally released from his 2-year sentence, the Gestapo is there waiting for him to be released from the German prison. They immediately take him into custody. And then they say, and now that no one is watching, no one is paying attention that Monsignor Lichtenberg has been released from prison, now you're going to get your wish. We're going to put you on a deportation train. In reality, they put him on a train that is destined to take particularly a group of religious leaders to Dachau concentration camp. And Lichtenberg, his health was so damaged from those 2 years in prison that he actually dies on the train in transit to Dachau concentration camp. So he never actually gets to be a part of the deportations, but this is a good example of a person who was willing to lay down his life, not just for a Catholic issue, but for the violation of human behavior. I'm going to give you another example because so far I've only been able to give you male examples. And this one gets me very excited because there's really no book, no biography in English about this woman, Margarete Sommer. And she is really this amazing woman. And again, when we look at, church leadership, of course, in the Catholic Church, we have nuns who are pretty darn brave as well, but we are really focused on, these priests that can make decisions, cardinals and bishops. But here we have a lay person, Margareta Zummer, and you can see on the slide, she's born in 1893. And during the First World War in Germany, she volunteers and is trained to be an auxiliary nurse, very nationalistic, wants to help. And in the 1920s, she does something virtually unheard of. She gets her PhD. And she's one of the first women in modern Germany to get a PhD. It's in social work, but she has studied history and philosophy, you name it. She's just this amazing woman. Once she has that higher degree of a PhD, she can be a lecturer in universities, and that's what she's pursuing. She's supporting her aging mother and a sister, and she's performing all of this lecturing and so forth. And in 1934, a year into Hitler being the leader of Germany, she's fired from her university position, primarily because she refused to incorporate lectures on forced sterilization into her material. And this was kind of, again, part of Nazi policy, that unhealthy Aryans needed to be sterilized so that they could not continue to pass on their so-called defective blood. She refuses to do that, and she loses her job. That means she has to immediately find some other employment because she's got a mother and a sister to financially support besides herself. She is in the Berlin area, so she approaches the Catholic charities organizations, and she becomes a member of the Catholic charitable organizations. And at first, Margareta Zummer, with all of her training, and again, her toolkit's going to be a little bit different than von Galen or a Niemöller. Um, she is trained as a social worker, right? And so they say, all right, you're going to be helping what are called non-Aryan Catholics. This is, again, part of that Nazi crazy worldview that you could be, say, I'm Catholic. I've been baptized as a Catholic. I'm confirmed as a Catholic. I go to church every single day. But the Nazis don't care what you as an individual say you are. It's not really about a religious practice, it's racial. And so these are individuals who, at some point in their family history, had a Jewish relative, whether it's a parent, a grandparent. They themselves could have been Jewish and had converted to Catholicism. They all get lumped into this non-Aryan Catholic group. And they're going to suffer a certain degree of persecution. It's not as severe in the early days as what the Nazis call full Jews. And so Margareta Zummer is supposed to help these people. Again, this is kind of focusing in Catholic worldview. These are Catholic people. Doesn't matter if they themselves were Jewish. They've converted, they've been baptized, they're Catholic. And so what does she do? She's particularly interested in helping people flee the country. And so using all of her social work skill set, she's helping these persecuted people fill out the paperwork. And the Nazis create reams and reams of paperwork. Fill out the paperwork, get all the visa applications, look for countries that will accept refugees, that will take people in. And so she's assisting with that particular portion of the population. She's trying to, in particular, save orphaned children that have been placed in this category of mixed Jewish blood, non-Aryan Catholics. And so she begins, while she's working with that population, she begins to write letters and compile reports so that every year when the Catholic bishops and cardinals meet in the town of Fulda, that they will know what kind of perilous situation these so-called non-Aryan Catholics are facing. She gets wind in Berlin that the Nazi regime is contemplating forcing people in what the Nazis called mixed marriages, which would mean one person is an Aryan and one person has been designated as part Jewish or fully Jewish. And of course, Catholic teaching, there's no divorce, right? And so they not never implement that, but they were discussing it. She's heard about it. And so she's going to raise an alarm. And this is one moment where Catholics and Protestants join forces. And it's because of Margaret Zummer in particular. She reaches out to Lutheran ministers and say, look, your people are going to be impacted by this too. If the regime forcibly dissolves marriages that you have sanctified in your church, and to try to deport and take away the so-called Jewish spouse. This will escalate for Zummer. She is now fully engaged in rescue operations and resistance, and she has been that extraordinary person who says, yes, Catholics and these so-called non-Aryan Catholics are being persecuted, but now we have to start working with Jews. Their lives are on the line. And so we must work harder. And so when those deportations begin, and when Father Lichtenberg is arrested and imprisoned, the Bishop of Berlin moves Margareta Zummer into what's called a special relief office. And that is really designed not only to help these non-Aryan Catholics, but to help Jewish people as well. And so now Margareta Zummer and the team in that special relief office, they get fully engaged in what are they doing? Okay, they know Jewish people who have received their letters of deportation, right? And so they bring care packages, and in some cases, they say if they can't thwart the deportation, they can at least help them pack and give them supplies. But at the same time, Margareta Zummer is beginning to establish a network of safe houses so that if people say, I'm not going on the deportation train, to try to get them into hiding and to secure locations, she takes it upon herself to actually follow those deportation trains. And she secretly visits ghetto sites and she witnesses some of those mass shootings at open pits. So she has, at great risk to herself, she could have at any time been caught, been accused of treason. She could have been executed, but she has gone into full on relief work combined with rescue operations. She has been able to use the art of the possible, what skill sets that she brought to all of her years of training and academic work have brought her into this idea of we are going to fight to save Jewish lives. In the end, she gets into an enormous struggle. The leader of all of the Catholic bishops and cardinals in Germany was a cardinal by the name of Bertram. And Bertram was very cautious person. He didn't want to poke Hitler and agitate him. And so for Bertram, he becomes very nervous about allowing Margareta Zummer to give those reports, because he realizes if she reports on what she has seen in ghettos and at mass execution sites, disproving Nazi propaganda that Jews are working in factories and on farms, if the bishops and cardinals have that information from an eyewitness, then they are compelled to take action. They should be forced to do something. And he doesn't want to do anything about it. It's too risky. And in Bertram's mind, and to a certain extent in a guy like von Galen's mind, if the bishops and cardinals did something, then they think it will unleash the equivalent level of persecution against the Catholic population, and they're not willing to risk it. Ultimately, for Margareta Zummer, she is barred from giving any of her eyewitness accounts and reports to the bishops. She will continue her work, and she and her colleagues in that special relief agency compose a letter that they would like Bertram to approve, and they would like every priest to read it out on the same day in church. And here you can see a picture of Margareta Sommer as an older woman. And in that letter, I think she has this very powerful statement, and it says, "We will stand guilty before God and man if we are silent." So here is that person who is saying, you cannot comply, you cannot be a good Catholic and a good Nazi, and you actually have to do something about it. She's using all of her social worker skills to kind of put things in motion, and she's encouraging as many other Catholics as possible. I'm going to give you just another example, and this is a very famous Protestant minister and theologian by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer, from an early time period, was very aware that what the Nazis were doing was forcing people to make a choice. Can I be a good Christian and a good Nazi? And you can see on the opening of the slide that Hitler becomes the leader of Germany in January, the 30th of January, 1933. And in February of 1933, a young Dietrich Bonhoeffer gives a sermon. And what is it that he says? He says, "In the church, we have only one altar, the altar of the Most High, the one and only, the Almighty, the Lord, to whom alone be honor and praise. We don't have any side altars at which to worship human beings." Now, this is a guy who's already aware that there's the cult of Hitler, the cult of the Fuhrer. This is very similar to what Martin Niemöller says in Obey God Rather Than Men in 1937. But here we have Dietrich Bonhoeffer in 1933, a month into Hitler being the leader, telling people we don't idolize humans, we only have our Lord, right? So he is trained as a theologian, right? And so what can he do to fight against Nazi ideology? And what he begins to do is go into the toolkit. I'm a theologian. I can train other young people to be good theologians, right? To be good ministers, to be good pastors. And so he begins running a kind of forbidden seminary that's affiliated with the Confessing Church. And if you remember way at the beginning, we talked about the Confessing Church was that group that said, we don't agree with the German Christians, and we have to take a hard stance on the government cannot interfere in matters of theology, in matters of church governance. And so Bonhoeffer is using the tools at his disposal. Eventually, that seminary is forced to be closed, and Bonhoeffer does not give up. He actually retreats into a very remote region of Pomerania, and he again starts another seminary. And so he is refusing to give in. Now, at that moment, he's still really focused on kind of Lutheran concerns and Lutheran issues. But over the course of the next several years, Bonhoeffer gets very involved in a large group of conspirators who are thinking about how can we end the Nazi regime, right? And what would Germany look like without Hitler, without the Nazi party? When Germany goes to war in 1939, Bonhoeffer is a pacifist, so he's not going to volunteer to be a soldier. But because of family connections, he is able to get a position in what's called the Abwehr. And that means kind of secret military intelligence. And that position allows Bonhoeffer to have access to all these different top secret documents that are talking about mass killings of Jews at open pits, about what is being done to Jews in ghettos. He has access to this information, and he is going to become more radicalized because of this. And he really digs his heels in and says it is the Christian person's responsibility to aid victims of government persecution. So here again, much like a Margaret Sommer, he has kind of gone well beyond that narrow confines of a von Galen or even a Niemöller, and says we have to think in these broader terms. Even if they do not belong to a Christian community, it is our responsibility as Christians to look out for, in particular, Jews. Because of his work with military intelligence, he is able to travel. So he's got mobility. He can leave Nazi Germany. He goes to Switzerland. He goes to Sweden. He goes to Norway. And what does he do while he's there? He uses the skills that he's acquired now working in secret intelligence to approach foreign individuals and kind of float the idea of the big what if. What if there's a group of people inside of Nazi Germany who want to overthrow Hitler? What would your government's reaction be? Would you support us? And kind of, again, really taking these large steps to try to bring the Nazi regime to an end. And while he's doing that, he's still preaching, right? He's still teaching. And he says, I want you to become radical in your love of neighbor in a dangerous way, right? So it is dangerous. He knows it's dangerous, but he's telling people this is required of you, that it's a matter of conscience. You have to behave in this way. And he often uses the metaphor of a wheel crushing the victims of National Socialism. And he says it is a Christian's job to be the spike or to put a stick in the wheel that stops the wheel from crushing even more victims. As you can imagine, because he is outspoken, ultimately he is arrested in April of 1943. Of course, he is charged with treasonous behavior. He is transferred from a few different concentration camps. By all accounts of the prisoners that were in these camps alongside him, he was an ideal role model person. He preached sermons to those who were interested and willing to listen. He was allowed to continue to have access to papers so he could continue developing his theology. And so even as an inmate in a concentration camp, he continued to try to rally people's spirits, to try to keep the gospel alive while he is there. So he's using every tool that he has in the art of the possible. And unfortunately for Bonhoeffer, in April of 1945, he is in his cell with other prisoners, and two civilian dressed men enter the cell and begin to take him out with him. And a British captured intelligence officer was there with Niemöller. And he says Niemöller knew when those two men came in dressed as civilians that they were taking him out and that he only had a short while left to live. They take him out on the 8th of April, 1945. And as he walked past this British prisoner, he says, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." And on the 9th of April, 1945, at Flossenbürg concentration camp, Dietrich Bonhoeffer mounts a gallows and is executed. And it is even, that is sad enough to think about, but it's even sadder still when you find out that Flossenbürg concentration camp will be liberated within the next 2 weeks. And had that directive to kill Bonhoeffer not been carried out, we still might have benefited from his experiences and his outlook on the world. I would like to kind of conclude by again thanking Shelley Klein for inviting me to give this presentation. I would encourage everyone who's thinking about these ideas of Christian resistance to think about the art of the possible, that you think about what skills do I have? How can I use my skills? Maybe I can write letters of protest. If there's something going on that violates my conscience, maybe I can do that. Maybe I can join a protest. Maybe I can march. Maybe I can stand in solidarity. Maybe I can bring comfort to people who are suffering. These are all kind of within the realm of possibility, and that Christian resistance doesn't end with this story of the Nazi regime. And so, again, my sincere thanks to everyone who has tuned in to be a part of this presentation, and my thanks to the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education and Dr. Shelley Klein. Thank you so much.